It wasn't the silence of the woods that bothered me. It was the listening that came with it. I could handle the quiet, the total absence of sirens, street chatter, or even the familiar, mundane churn of a neighborhood's distant air conditioning units. What really started to crawl under my skin was that heavy, wet blanket of oral vacuum. It pressed in, making everything inside the house louder, more noticeable. The drip of the faucet, the settling groan of the old foundation, and worst of all, the sound of my wife talking to someone who was never there. This whole miserable breakdown started about 5 months ago, though the foundations were probably laid long before that. I'm 34, and my wife, Clara, is a year younger. We had what a normal couple calls too much debt, too much stress, too much noise, and too many expectations from lives we didn't want anymore. I was a software project manager in downtown Atlanta, and Clara did marketing support for a big pharma company. We were exhausted. So, we did what every burnout millennial couple dreams of. We sold everything and bought an ancient, crumbling A-frame cabin deep in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, off a forgotten little state road outside nowhere, Tennessee. We traded high-speed internet and city convenience for total, blissful isolation. At least, that's what we told ourselves. It was supposed to be a reset. It became something else entirely. For context, neither of us were prepared for this level of remoteness. Sure, we'd read cabin porn books and watched simple life documentaries. But in Atlanta, if Spotify quit, you just got better data. Here, if the intermittent power went out, it was out. Our dirt drive was a 7-mile ribbon of misery cut directly into the underbrush, accessible only by my battered Ford pickup, and we rarely drove it if we could help it. The woods were beautiful, truly immense, covered in damp moss, and stretching up high enough to swallow the light, but they were overwhelmingly close to the cabin. I'd wake up some mornings, look out a window, and it felt less like we lived in the woods and more like we were living in a high-piled carpet of ancient green things. I should have known something was wrong barely a month in. Clara had never taken to the quiet like I thought she would. She started looking hollow-eyed and spent hours just sitting by the only west-facing window, staring at the canopy. I figured it was the cabin fever. Then, a few nights after the 1-month mark, I woke up around 1 a.m. and heard it for the first time. The distinct sound of my wife's low voice, not singing or thinking aloud, but speaking. Talking. She didn't have her phone, and our ancient, useless landline hadn't made a sound in weeks, even if it was technically hooked up. I waited about 10 minutes until I was sure. "Clara?" I whispered, rolling over and finding her side of the bed cold. I pushed myself up and followed the soft drone to the kitchen area, which opened up to a dilapidated screened lean-to we called the porch. She was standing there in an old sweater, not moving, looking out into absolute blackness. She was whispering, fast, in the conversational pattern you use when you're dictating data to someone. A pause, then a sentence, then a pause for a reply, and then another sentence. "Yes, the weather will hold. No, he hasn't looked for it yet. Keep observing and give me the next vector when it shifts." Pause. Then she made a brief, almost robotic, humming sound, a placeholder for another person's acknowledgement. My mind immediately began scrambling for normal possibilities. She was an imaginative person. Maybe she'd downloaded one of those oddball voice memo apps for late-night journaling. Maybe she found an old walkie-talkie? I hated the idea of sneaking up on her, so I announced myself. "Clara, honey? Who are you talking to?" She stiffened immediately, her back rigid. The whispering stopped instantly. She turned very slowly, and when she did, her eyes were so wide and unnervingly vacant they gave me a shiver. She had that deer-in-headlights look, the one you get when you're caught doing something you shouldn't, but on her, mixed with the darkness, it came off as genuinely unsettling. "Elias! You startled me. What time is it?" she said, her voice surprisingly steady, though it lacked any heat. "Just talking to myself. Processing. You know, getting out the thoughts aloud. Stress from the move, sweetie. You should go back to bed." I didn't believe her, but what was I going to do? Accuse her of an invisible conversation? My paranoia needed to be kept grounded. I needed proof. So, like the concerned, rational husband, I went back to rationalizing it and tried to let it go. Jackson in that city story would have laughed it off, thinking it was a joke. I tried to do the same, forcing myself to believe that the exhaustion of the woods was just making me hear things. The problem was that 3 nights later, I woke up to hear that low, careful drone again. And then again. And then a week after that, they started making visible changes. I had noticed a stack of granite landscape stones the cabin's previous, crazy owner had left for a project. Now they were gone. I found them instead outside the screened lean-to where the nightly talking was happening. They were arranged in small, specific, almost runic-looking stacks, almost like little cairns, placed in 4 specific points around the immediate property line, less like garden decorations and more like some sort of markers or boundary stones. And worse yet, the back door, our main protection against the mountain wildlife, was consistently left slightly ajar. Cracked open, just an infuriating inch, even when the fog would roll in thick and heavy, like she was saving a seat for someone who was cold outside. At this point, I'd lost the ability to rationalize it as stress or talking to herself. The conversation wasn't verbal journaling, it was an interaction. It felt like she was being given instructions. Something dangerous I couldn't perceive was happening, similar to how the cloaked person in the city story was moving toward an outcome other than just walking the street. I started sleeping less and less. I was always on edge, hyper-alert, paying attention to the periphery, the rustle of branches, sounds inside the walls. I started keeping the old 12-gauge within an arm's reach, not against bear or deer, but against suspicion. It was also when I noticed the pattern. Our little kerosene generator rarely ran past midnight. The conversations only ever happened in the absolute, pitch-black silence when that generator had been off for a long time. They seemed to prefer a complete lack of any machine noise to cloak their signal. They needed the purest, deadest quiet to connect. They were trying to be discreet, which told me 2 things. They knew I was listening, and they preferred I didn't get involved. I needed to make a bold move, like pulling out the Glock, but my threat was my spouse, not some stranger. I needed evidence. I hatched a plan. I spent a long, hard day clearing some brush up the hillside to make it look like I was totally wiped out. When I finally trudged back inside at 9 p.m., I ate a quick, massive plate of dinner, acted drowsy, and made a show of switching off the generator right before I slumped into bed, snoring loud enough to confirm my exhaustion. I stayed completely still, my heart thumping against my chest. Like Savannah knew I was armed in the other story, I knew Clara knew I was listening. At about 1:45 a.m., it started. No warning, just a sudden, soft, steady rhythm of conversation from the kitchen. It was more intense tonight. A louder gasping sound when her turn was done, indicating some sort of reply was happening that just wasn't verbal or audible in any normal human way, like an intake of air rather than an expulsion of lungs. I grabbed my heavy-duty lantern and padded on silent feet in thick wool socks into the kitchen. The door to the lean-to was, inevitably, slightly ajar. Unlike the dark porch I saw the first time, tonight she was standing by the window of the old workbench, an ancient, splintered wooden table mounted directly to the wall. She wasn't looking out the window, she was focused entirely on the workbench top. When I got close, I finally saw the truth. It wasn't a phone. It wasn't a family heirloom of some kind. Clara was speaking quietly and calmly into a shattered, oil-stained antique piece of equipment I vaguely recognized as an incredibly old, heavily modified, walkie-talkie receiver. It was stripped of all its visible wires and was resting on a piece of greasy oilskin. It should have been dead, a relic of the woodsman who built this place 100 years ago. And yet the speaker grill was emitting an agonizingly low, wet-sounding static, occasionally interrupted by a single, thin, metallic rap. That rasping static sound was the reply, and the rap was the punctuation, the acknowledgement for her to continue. It was like I was listening to the sound of metal breathing. I brought the scene into stark, orange light, throwing the heavy beam of the lantern down right onto the table like a hammer blow. Clara screamed. It wasn't a scared scream, but a shriek of intense, pure annoyance, like a chef whose expensive sauce had just been spilled. She spun instantly, moving faster than I'd seen her move since Atlanta, covering the pathetic-looking radio with both hands. Her eyes shifted completely. The vague worry was gone, replaced by that unnervingly malicious irritation I feared to see, like the fake cop wearing an unwanted tactical vest. "Elias! What the hell are you doing? Why can't you just sleep?" she hissed, her voice a raw thing I barely recognized. I didn't lower my guard, though I wasn't carrying a gun just yet. I pointed at the vibrating, broken receiver. "That's the someone you've been talking to? What is it, Clara? Is there a speaker outside? Are you in a play?" She didn't answer. She took a step closer, slowly removing her protective hands. I saw something then I hadn't noticed. Crude, uneven symbols were carved into the receiver's casing with something thin and sharp, not electrical diagrams, but more like primitive runes or old logging marks. The static grew infinitesimally higher in pitch. Then a subtle, knowing smile stretched across her face. It was the smile of someone who was no longer just a victim of whatever this was, but its willing participant. "You shouldn't have listened, Elias. You shouldn't have disturbed our signal." The malicious look solidified. She knew I knew, and like a standoff with an ununiformed officer, I couldn't risk a physical reaction. I backed up, keeping the lantern on the receiver. I didn't want to get arrested, but I wasn't leaving her to whatever this interaction was either. Eventually, I settled the matter with a lie, speaking with a confidence I didn't feel deep down. "Give me that. I'm taking it to town. There's some repair shop 90 miles away. Maybe they know how to switch this frequency, or filter the static. Anything to take the physical point of contact away from her." Clara didn't fight physically. She just slowly pushed the relic across the workbench to me. She was cold, distant, and utterly silent for the next 3 days. Using the excuse of buying some essential supplies, I left her, and the listener, isolated, and drove the miserable road down the mountain. 90 miles, 8 hours of driving in my temperamental Ford later, I got to a real, proper town with actual paved sidewalks. I found a dimly lit antique and surplus shop run by a local old man named Sam. He agreed to look at the radio for me. I told Sam what I had seen: the receiver, the late-night quiet, the mysterious conversation. I specifically showed him the runic markings carved onto the plastic casing. Sam didn't even plug it in. He just stared at the symbols. He got a look of recognition, but also of pity. "This ain't a transmitter problem, son. And it ain't broken radio components either," he said, shaking his head. "The radio is just how it travels." He explained that these symbols traced back to early mountain folk who were deep into isolation and, frankly, Appalachian folk magic. He talked about the hollow listener. Not a person, not a ghost, but an ancient mountain spirit, or, as he called it, an entity that waits for lost noise. It finds souls in total isolation. It promises simple peace and an attentive community after getting a conduit, namely, Clara, to set up the right things, like the stone markers and the perpetually ajar door. It uses any abandoned signal or sound system, broken radios, mine shafts, hollow logs. Its goal? To gather strength, and use the conduit's voice to lure more isolated folks in. He said this relic was one of the old ways. Those who get talking to it always leave a little bit of themselves behind, he warned, his eyes narrowing. Or worse, they never leave the property alive. His story, so utterly nonsensical on its surface, made perfect sense of the whole twisted encounter, just like how checking the house for a fake break-in confirmed the cop was lying. The danger wasn't my wife being crazy. The danger was that she had been in contact with the ancient craziness of this forgotten rock. I drove hell for leather back to the cabin, realizing that, like the original narrator trying to simply get his sister and nephew home, I too was caught up in something exponentially worse than I'd planned. I didn't waste time on a subtle approach. I parked the Ford, grabbed my already packed bag in the storage box, and moved toward the cabin. I had to assume the entity was inside Clara now. I was running from a possessed wife and an incorporeal community. As I reached the cabin door, Clara was waiting on the porch. She wasn't aggressive. She stood there, sentinel-like, oddly clean in a fresh white linen top, despite the muddy conditions. She just watched me. The light outside the cabin flickered desperately, the bulb fighting its useless war against the darkness. But now it wasn't just Clara. I didn't need the radio this time. The static was everywhere. It was in the crackling insulation of the walls. It was in the heavy, low-frequency hum of my refrigerator kicking on and off. The simple, low, wet, gasping sound of the listener, and now listeners, was no longer confined to the kitchen. I could hear multiple frequencies in the static, multiple hushed replies, as if the entire cabin itself was a giant, malfunctioning radio receiver. Sam's words echoed in my head, "The conduit attracts others," and I saw the parallel to the 4 others emerging from the shadows. I screamed at Clara to stay back, knowing it would be useless, and threw myself into my battered pickup, not giving a damn about the bag, the gas, or the generator running. I had to get to the first place I had even remotely consistent cell phone service. I tore back down the dreadful 7-mile road as a high-pitched, metallic whine started to rise from the engine block, sounding uncomfortably like the receiver's highest-pitched static. As I passed the last of the boundary stones, checking my side mirror, I saw the motion. Not Clara, but rapid black shape, almost dissolving figures, maybe shadows, maybe the other listeners, I still don't know, darting between the thick cedar and pine trees, tracking my passage parallel to the road for a fleeting instant until I hit 80 mph, and their movements couldn't keep up. 5 miles down the road there it was. One single, intermittent bar of service. Before doing anything else, I pulled up my messages. A new one had arrived. I instantly checked the number. It was Clara's cell phone. No words. Just an audio clip. My curiosity, my pure, sick need for closure, got the better of me. Typical. I tapped the play button. It was loud, grinding static, the wet gasp of the hollow listener, now unmistakable, almost deafening. And under it, Clara's calm, measured, utterly robotic voice, like the unblinking, unfeeling glare of the fake cop after her smile. "He's going back to Atlanta. He should have stayed quiet, but it doesn't matter. The signal knows where to find the quiet now, Elias. I live in a high-rise downtown now, miles from any natural quiet, exactly where I started. The windows are sealed, and the walls are padded with sound suppression foam. I am constantly paranoid, much like the narrator in that city horror story, forever feeling scrutinized. I miss Clara, the real one, deeply, but the thing I most fear is my air conditioning unit breaking down, or the hum of the fluorescent lights completely giving out in the dead of the night. My lesson is simple, I guess, for anyone caught up in something dangerous simply for existing, like the idea of the anonymous cop wanting to scare someone for their own amusement. Never confuse quiet for safety. The quiet, I now know, is where the listener sets its traps. Always be aware of your sound environment. You never know what's speaking to you when the lights go out, because the mountains don't need an invitation to fill your dead air. They only need a receiver, and a quiet soul.